Iran shouldn't be surviving. 40 years of American sanctions, the most comprehensive economic isolation campaign in modern history, should have collapsed the Iranian economy and forced regime change or capitulation decades ago. Instead, Iran's economy functions, oil exports continue, regional influence expands, and nuclear program advances. The contradiction between sanctions severity and Iranian resilience isn't just surprising, it reveals fundamental transformation in how global economics operates. Iran isn't surviving despite sanctions. Iran is pioneering the post-sanctions global economy, where American financial leverage no longer determines who trades with whom, what currencies transactions use, or which countries can access global commerce. The mechanisms Iran developed to evade sanctions, yuan-denominated oil trade with China, cryptocurrency transactions bypassing SWIFT, barter arrangements avoiding formal banking, and shadow tanker fleets invisible to Western tracking, are becoming the template for any country facing American pressure. Iran's silent move wasn't dramatic announcement or policy shift. It was patient construction of alternative systems that make sanctions increasingly irrelevant. And as more countries adopt these systems, the sanctions weapon that defined American power for decades is losing effectiveness, not because America stopped using it, but because the global economy is routing around it. Understanding why sanctions no longer work on Iran requires examining the specific mechanisms Iran developed, why these mechanisms are now available to other sanctioned countries, and what happens when the primary tool of American economic statecraft becomes obsolete. The Iran sanctions architecture is the most comprehensive ever implemented. The United States began sanctioning Iran after the 1979 revolution and hostage crisis. Sanctions expanded gradually through the 1990s, then dramatically after 2006, when Iran's nuclear program became the primary focus. By 2012, the sanctions regime was extraordinary in scope. Iranian banks were expelled from SWIFT, cutting Iran from international financial messaging. Iranian oil exports faced restrictions preventing most countries from purchasing Iranian crude. Iranian central bank was sanctioned, making it illegal for foreign banks to process transactions involving Iranian government. Secondary sanctions threatened any company or country doing business with Iran with loss of access to American markets and financial systems. Technology transfers to Iran were prohibited. Iranian assets in Western banks were frozen. Individual Iranian officials faced travel bans and asset freezes. The economic impact was severe initially. Iranian oil exports dropped from 2.5 million barrels per day in 2011 to under 1 million by 2013. The rial lost over 60% of its value. Inflation reached 40%. Imports became difficult as payment mechanisms were severed. Access to foreign currency dried up. The Iranian economy contracted. By the conventional logic of sanctions, Iran should have capitulated. The pressure was enormous, the isolation comprehensive, and the alternative to compliance was economic catastrophe. But Iran didn't capitulate. Instead, Iran adapted. The adaptation wasn't immediate or simple. It required building entirely new systems for conducting international commerce outside dollar-denominated, Western-controlled financial architecture. The process took years and involved trial and error, diplomatic negotiations with willing partners, and technical innovations in payment systems and logistics. But by 2020, Iran had functional alternative systems that made sanctions painful but survivable. And by 2024, those systems had matured enough that sanctions were becoming more nuisance than existential threat. The China-Iran energy relationship is the foundation of Iranian sanctions evasion. China is the world's largest oil importer and needs energy security that doesn't depend on American-controlled supply chains or payment systems. Iran has oil to sell and needs customers who won't comply with American sanctions. The mutual need created partnership that redefined how energy trade functions outside dollar systems. Chinese purchases of Iranian oil never stopped completely even during peak sanctions. but the volume and mechanism changed dramatically. During the JCPOA period from 2015-2018, Iranian oil exports to China averaged 600,000 barrels per day through normal commercial channels using dollar pricing. After Trump withdrew from JCPOA and reimposed maximum pressure sanctions in 2018, official Chinese imports of Iranian oil supposedly dropped to near zero. But actual Chinese imports didn't decline. They just went dark. The technical mechanisms are sophisticated. Iranian oil is loaded onto tankers that turn off AIS transponders, the automatic identification systems that broadcast ship positions. These tankers conduct ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, moving oil from Iranian-flagged vessels to third-country tankers. The receiving tankers then falsify documentation, claiming the oil originated in Iraq, Oman, or Malaysia. The oil arrives at Chinese ports with paperwork showing non-Iranian origin. Chinese customs accepts the documentation without excessive scrutiny. Chinese state-owned oil companies purchase the oil at substantial discounts, typically 20–30% below market prices for equivalent crude grades. The operational specifics reveal the sophistication. Iranian tankers load crude at Karg Island Terminal in the Persian Gulf. They sail to designated transfer zones in the Strait of Malacca, South China Sea, or off Malaysian coast. The transfers occur at night using smaller vessels as intermediaries. A typical transfer involves 1 to 2 million barrels taking 12–24 hours. The receiving vessels are often very large crude carriers, flying Panamanian or Liberian flags owned by shell companies in Dubai or Singapore. These vessels then sail to Chinese ports, primarily Dalian, Qingdao, and ports in Shandong province. The documentation fraud is systematic. Bills of lading show Basra, Iraq as load port when oil actually came from Karg Island, Iran. Certificates of origin claim Omani or Malaysian crude blends that contain majority Iranian oil. The paperwork passes through Malaysian, Iraqi, or Emirati intermediaries who provide apparent legitimacy. Chinese customs officials have access to satellite tracking data that would reveal the actual ship movements. But enforcement discretion allows the shipments through when paperwork is technically complete, even if everyone knows the oil's true origin. The discount pricing reflects risk premium buyers' demand for sanctions evasion. Iranian heavy crude trades at $65–70 per barrel when Brent is at $85–90. The 20–25% discount compensates buyers for legal risks, insurance costs, and reputational exposure. For Iran, receiving $65 per barrel outside sanctions is better than receiving $85 within sanctions systems where payment would be blocked. For China, saving $15–20 per barrel on 1.5 million barrels daily equals $22–30 million daily in cost reductions, approximately $8–11 billion annually. The economics justify the effort. The pricing mechanism operates entirely outside dollar systems. China doesn't pay Iran in dollars, which would require routing transactions through SWIFT and Western banks that would be flagged and blocked. Instead, China pays in yuan deposited in Chinese banks. Iran cannot easily convert those yuan to dollars without again exposing transactions to sanctions enforcement. So Iran uses yuan directly for purchases of Chinese goods, for investments in Chinese infrastructure projects, or converts yuan to gold through Shanghai Gold Exchange and other mechanisms that don't touch Western financial systems. The volumes are substantial. Satellite imagery analysis, tanker tracking, and Chinese import data suggest China imported 1.2–1.5 million barrels per day of Iranian oil through 2023 and 2024. This is significantly above official figures and represents over 60% of Iranian oil production. At $70 per barrel, this is approximately $30–40 billion in annual oil revenue that Iran receives entirely outside Western financial oversight. The revenue isn't subject to sanctions because the transactions never touch dollar systems, never route through SWIFT, never involve Western banks. China benefits from this arrangement through discounted oil prices and energy security independent of American preferences. Iran benefits through revenue and proof that comprehensive sanctions can be circumvented. The losers are Saudi Arabia and other Gulf producers who must compete with discounted Iranian crude, and American sanctioners who discover their most powerful economic weapon is increasingly optional rather than mandatory for countries willing to operate outside dollar systems. The shadow financial system extends beyond oil trade to encompass all Iranian international commerce. Iran cannot use conventional banking for imports because Iranian banks are sanctioned, and foreign banks won't risk American penalties by processing Iranian transactions, so Iran developed alternative mechanisms that bypass formal banking entirely. Cryptocurrency became one mechanism, though less significant than Western media often suggests. Iran experimented with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies for international payments. Some Iranian businesses use crypto to receive payments from foreign customers without routing through banks. Iranian government reportedly mined Bitcoin using subsidized electricity to generate foreign currency reserves that aren't subject to seizure like dollar or euro accounts. But cryptocurrency's volatility, technical complexity, and limited acceptance by mainstream businesses means it serves niche rather than central role in Iranian sanctions evasion. More significant are the informal value transfer networks, Hawala, and similar systems that have existed in Middle East and South Asia for centuries. Hawala operates through networks of brokers who arrange transfers without moving money across borders. An Iranian importer who needs to pay a Chinese exporter contacts a Hawala broker in Iran. The broker instructs a partner broker in China to pay the Chinese exporter from the Chinese broker's funds. The Iranian broker collects equivalent amount in reals from the Iranian importer. The balances between brokers are settled later through trade transactions, cash transfers, or gold shipments. No formal banking is involved. No international wire transfers occur. The transaction is invisible to sanctions enforcement. The system's elegance lies in trust networks built over generations. Hawala brokers, hawaladars, operate through family connections, ethnic ties, and reputational stakes that make fraud prohibitively costly. A hawaladar who fails to honor obligations loses not just business but family reputation across networks spanning multiple countries. This reputational collateral is worth more than any formal legal enforcement mechanism. The operational example clarifies how this works practically. An Iranian construction company needs to pay $2 million for German machinery purchased through Turkish intermediary. The Iranian company cannot wire transfer funds because Iranian banks are sanctioned, and German sellers won't accept Iranian payments. Instead, the Iranian company pays 60 billion rials, equivalent $2 million, to a hawaladar in Tehran. That hawaladar contacts a partner in Istanbul who pays $2 million to the Turkish intermediary from Turkish bank accounts. The Turkish intermediary pays the German supplier through normal banking. The transaction appears as Turkish purchase from Germany, no Iranian involvement visible. The Tehran and Istanbul hawaladars now have imbalance. Istanbul hawaladar is down $2 million, while Tehran hawaladar is up 60 billion rials. This imbalance is settled through reverse transactions. When a Turkish business wants to buy Iranian carpets or pistachios, they pay the Istanbul hawaladar in euros, who instructs the Tehran hawaladar to pay the Iranian seller in rials from the surplus rials from the construction company transaction. Over dozens or hundreds of transactions, the balances equilibrate. Any persistent imbalance is settled through physical transfer of gold, cash, or commodities. The volumes moving through informal value transfer are estimated in tens of billions annually. These aren't small retail transactions. Major Iranian businesses use Hawala networks for commercial imports of machinery, components, and consumer goods. The networks are sophisticated, reliable, and completely outside formal financial oversight. They existed before sanctions, but have expanded dramatically as sanctions made formal banking impossible. The direct barter arrangements represent another mechanism. Iran provides oil to Turkish traders who provide gold bullion that Iran uses to pay for other imports. Iran provides oil to Indian refiners who provide pharmaceuticals, rice, and machinery without monetary payments changing hands. Iran provides weapons and military support to Syria and Yemen, receiving political alignment and strategic positioning rather than monetary payment. The barter economy isn't efficient by modern commercial standards, but it functions when formal monetary systems are inaccessible. Turkey serves as particularly important sanctions evasion hub. Turkish banks, particularly state-owned Halkbank, allegedly processed billions in Iran-related transactions disguised as gold for oil trades. The mechanism involved Iranian oil sold to Turkish customers, with payment in Turkish lira deposited in Turkish banks. Iran then used those lira deposits to purchase Turkish gold, which was physically shipped to Iran. Iran sold the gold in Dubai or other markets for dollars or other currencies. The scheme allowed Iran to convert oil revenue into usable foreign currency despite sanctions prohibiting such conversions. American prosecutors eventually indicted Turkish bankers and Halkbank itself for sanctions violations, but the scheme operated for years before detection and prosecution. The specific mechanics were elaborate. Between 2012-2016, Turkey purchased approximately $13 billion worth of Iranian natural gas, paying Halkbank accounts in Turkish lira. Under humanitarian exemption in sanctions regime, Turkey was technically allowed to purchase Iranian energy, but payments were supposed to remain frozen for humanitarian use only. Instead, Iranian entities used the lira funds to purchase gold from Turkish refineries. The gold, estimated at 250 tons worth approximately $10 billion, was then physically flown to Dubai on private jets. The gold arrived in Dubai and was immediately sold to gold merchants for dollars or euros. Those hard currencies were then available for Iran's international purchases without any traceable connection to sanctioned oil revenue. The chain broke sanctions because the gold purchase appeared as legitimate commercial transaction within Turkey. The gold export appeared as Dubai gold market trading, and the currency generation appeared as gold merchant business in UAE, none directly showing Iranian sanctions evasion. The scheme unraveled when Turkish-Iranian gold trader Reza Zarrab was arrested in Miami in 2016 and cooperated with prosecutors. His testimony revealed systematic sanctions evasion involving Halkbank executives, Turkish government officials, and Iranian operatives. Halkbank Deputy General Manager Mehmet Hakan Atilla was convicted in U.S. court in 2018. Halkbank itself was indicted in 2019. But the legal proceedings took years, during which the scheme had already moved billions. The prosecution sent message, but the damage was done. Iran had successfully monetized oil exports through Turkish gold route for years. The shadow tanker fleet deserves particular attention because it enables the entire oil export system to function. Iran controls a fleet of approximately 100-150 tankers that operate specifically for sanctions evasion. These tankers are old, often poorly maintained, and flagged to countries with minimal maritime oversight like Panama, Liberia, or Sierra Leone. They turn off AIS transponders to avoid tracking. They engage in ship-to-ship transfers in international waters to obscure cargo origins. They falsify documentation to make Iranian oil appear to originate elsewhere. They're owned through multiple layers of shell companies registered in Dubai, Hong Kong, or other jurisdictions that don't cooperate fully with American sanctions enforcement. Western governments attempt to sanction these tankers by identifying them and adding them to sanctions lists. But new tankers simply replace sanctioned vessels. Shell companies are dissolved and reformed. Flags are changed. The cat-and-mouse game continues, with Iran staying ahead through constant adaptation. The United States sanctions dozens of tankers annually, but Iranian oil continues flowing to China and other buyers because the supply of willing vessels exceeds sanctioning capacity. The insurance dimension matters because maritime law requires tankers to carry insurance for potential spills or accidents. Western insurance companies won't cover Iranian oil shipments because sanctions prohibit it. So Iranian and Chinese insurance companies provide coverage that Western authorities don't recognize as legitimate. This creates legal gray zones where tankers operate without insurance that would be accepted by Western courts, but with coverage that suffices for Chinese ports and Iranian oil terminals. The legal fiction allows commerce to continue outside Western legal frameworks. The technology transfer restrictions are supposed to prevent Iran from accessing advanced equipment that could support nuclear program or missile development. These restrictions were always more difficult to enforce than financial sanctions because physical goods can be smuggled through third countries. Iran imports prohibited technology by routing it through Dubai, Turkey, Malaysia, or other transshipment points. Components are purchased by front companies with non-Iranian registration. Shipments are subdivided to avoid scrutiny. Customs documentation is falsified to misrepresent end users and purposes. The sanctions slow Iran's access to advanced technology, but don't prevent it. They just increase costs and delays. The intellectual comparison to 1990s Iraq sanctions is instructive. Iraq faced comprehensive sanctions from 1990 to 2003, including oil export restrictions and import prohibitions. Those sanctions devastated Iraqi economy and caused humanitarian catastrophe without changing government behavior. Iranian sanctions were supposed to avoid that outcome through targeted design, focusing on regime rather than population. But targeted sanctions require sophisticated enforcement mechanisms that can distinguish legitimate from illegitimate transactions. When Iran developed methods to conduct entire economy outside systems where such distinctions are possible, targeted sanctions became moot. Transactions that cannot be monitored cannot be selectively blocked. The JCPOA period from 2015-2018 demonstrated that sanctions relief doesn't erase the alternative systems Iran built. When JCPOA removed nuclear-related sanctions, Iranian oil exports resumed through normal channels and Iranian banks rejoined SWIFT. But Iran maintained the shadow systems developed during peak sanctions as insurance against renewed pressure. When Trump withdrew from JCPOA and reimposed sanctions, Iran reactivated those systems within months. The infrastructure and partnerships didn't disappear during sanctions relief. They remained dormant, ready for reactivation. This means future sanctions relief would face similar problem. Iran now has permanent capacity to operate outside Western-controlled systems that can be activated whenever sanctions return. The regional dimension shows how Iranian sanctions evasion creates templates others adopt. Russia, facing comprehensive sanctions after Ukraine invasion, studied Iranian methods and adapted them. Russian oil exports to India and China use similar tanker transponder shutoffs, falsified documentation, and yuan pricing. Russian banks expelled from SWIFT replicate Iranian correspondent banking through willing Chinese and Emirati institutions. Russian gold sales follow Iranian precedents. The more countries that adopt Iranian evasion methods, the more normalized these practices become, and the less effective sanctions are against anyone. Venezuela, North Korea, Syria, and others facing sanctions all study and adapt Iranian mechanisms. The result is proliferation of sanctions evasion infrastructure that makes enforcement progressively harder. Each sanctioned country that finds workarounds creates pathways other sanctioned countries can follow. The knowledge of how to evade sanctions becomes democratized, not through formal coordination, but through observation and adaptation. The cryptocurrency dimension may grow more significant as technology matures. Current cryptocurrencies are too volatile and technically complex for large-scale commercial use. But central bank digital currencies in development could provide sanctions evasion mechanisms that are both efficient and difficult to control. If China launches digital yuan, Iran could conduct trade denominated in digital currency that bypasses SWIFT, Western banks, and dollar systems entirely while providing efficiency of modern digital payments. The technology is developing specifically in countries seeking to reduce dollar dependence and sanctions vulnerability. The fundamental question is whether sanctions can work against any country that has large enough economy and willing trade partners to justify building alternative systems. Small countries remain vulnerable because building alternative payment systems requires scale economies that small trade volumes cannot support. But large oil exporters like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela can justify infrastructure investments in alternative systems because their export volumes are sufficient. The threshold appears to be approximately $50–100 billion in annual trade. Countries below that threshold find sanctions economically devastating. Countries above can build workarounds that make sanctions painful but survivable. The political will in sanctioning countries matters because enforcement requires resources, diplomatic capital, and sustained focus. The United States has enormous enforcement capacity but finite attention. When American focus shifts from Iranian sanctions to Russian sanctions or Chinese technology restrictions, Iranian sanctions enforcement inevitably weakens. Iran exploits these attention gaps to expand evasion networks. Every sanctions regime requires constant monitoring and updating as targets adapt. When monitoring weakens, evasion expands. The lesson from Iranian sanctions is that economic isolation is no longer viable against countries with scale, willing partners, and patience to build alternatives. The 40-year Iranian sanctions campaign produced outcomes opposite to those intended. Iran's nuclear program advanced. Iran's regional influence expanded. Iran's economy survived. And Iran pioneered alternative systems that make Western sanctions progressively less relevant. The silent move wasn't dramatic policy announcement. It was patient construction of post-sanctions economic infrastructure that now provides template for any country Washington threatens. The sanctions weapon is losing power not because America stopped using it, but because targets learned to ignore it. The comparative historical perspective reveals the transformation. Sanctions worked during the Cold War and immediate post-Cold War period because global commerce operated through systems the United States controlled or could pressure allies to control. SWIFT was Western-dominated. The dollar was unchallenged. Major banks feared American market exclusion. Oil trade occurred in dollars through Western trading houses. No alternatives existed at scale. The 1990s Iraq sanctions demonstrated peak sanctions effectiveness. Iraq's oil exports were monitored through UN mechanisms. Iraqi revenue was held in escrow accounts. Imports were screened through Oil for Food program. Iraq had no alternatives because no major power was willing to systematically violate sanctions for Iraqi benefit. The result was comprehensive economic isolation that devastated Iraqi economy without changing government, but proved sanctions could achieve economic isolation when globally coordinated. Iran in 2024 faces theoretically tighter sanctions than Iraq in 1990s, but maintains better economic function because the global system transformed. China provides willing buyer for Iranian oil, specifically to reduce dollar dependence and sanctions vulnerability. Digital technology enables informal value transfer at scales previously impossible. The proliferation of sanctioned states creates knowledge sharing about evasion methods. The multipolar fragmentation means no single power can enforce global sanctions compliance. The trajectory is clear. Each additional country that faces sanctions and develops workarounds makes sanctions less effective against all targets. The infrastructure built for Iranian sanctions evasion serves Russian sanctions evasion. The techniques refined by North Korea inform Venezuelan practices. The cryptocurrency developments motivated by sanctions evasion create tools any future target can adopt. The sanctions playbook is now public knowledge, and the defenses against it are increasingly robust.